the push. I use this transition all the time. At its most basic form, a push transition will move clip A to the left until it exits the frame, while clip B is also moved left until it fully enters the frame. Or you could push right or up or down. But you can't really push at any other angle because video is rectangular, and that would show the nothingness behind it. There are ways around this, but I'll get to that later. Despite being limited to just 4 directions, this transition is incredibly useful. As a rule of thumb, I use the push transition to show movement through time or space. I'll show you space first. Here are 2 shots taken on my Eclipse road trip. I'll play them with a straight cut in between. Look at all of those RVs. It's endless. And we just passed a storage place. See? It's storage for the RVs. This is where they go to die. With a push transition, we can make this better. First, let's try push left. Also, I need to redo the narration to make it way more concise. Buy an RV here, store the RV there. Definitely better, but a push left was the wrong choice, because it's not moving in the same direction as the underlying footage, and it's not indicating the direction that we've moved through space. The second shot genuinely did happen just a little ways further down that same road. So let's fix that with a push right instead, and let's speed it up. Also, let's add a fast whoosh sound effect. Buy an RV here, store the RV there. That's much better. If you want to use a push transition, a push right is the only correct option for this. Left, up, or down simply don't work as well. Also, just for fun, because both of these shots have a built-in zoom, I'm going to adjust the timing to try to integrate that. Buy an RV here, store the RV there. Oh, that's just great. Alternatively, you could try a soft edge wipe. Buy an RV here, store the RV there. That actually looks pretty good too, because the wipe moves in the same direction as all the other stuff we're passing. Turns out, for these 2 shots, because they're already in motion, we don't actually need to use a push to add more motion to them. Let's try a dissolve instead. Buy an RV here, store the RV there. This is definitely worse than the push and the wipe. It still kinda works because the joke is funny, but I'd say it's even worse than a straight cut. Remember, you're trying to avoid using dissolves for everything. This footage did not make it into the Eclipse vlogs, by the way, but it's funny, so I at least wanted to show it here. Here's another example.
It's like fortifying the crap out of the front of your house during the purge and not realizing there's a basement window that you never used. Oh no.
It works well because it simulates looking around a house for potential entrances. I have also used the push transition a lot to simulate looking around on a web page. And I do this because I didn't want to bother manually keyframing with the motion or transform effect. The push transition is just so much easier. This won't work as well if you don't include motion blur, which is why I use motion blur. Also, sometimes I will manually animate the web page, even if it's just a slight continuation of the motion I used in the push transition that got us here. But that's still a lot less work than using the motion effect for everything. A true push transition can also be used on objects that are smaller than the whole frame, and this is where it really shines. I think I've used it for this more than anything else. Back when I edited Tech Quickie, I'd constantly move the host in and out of the frame as needed, mostly using the push transition. And I'd use it to move stuff they were talking about in and out of the frame. This is really easy, since those objects are probably already on their own layers. Just add a push transition to the head or tail of those clips, and they'll just animate themselves in or out. No keyframing required. Though I often like to add a bit of subtle motion or rotation to an object, so it's not just sitting there completely unmoving, because that's kind of boring. Though sometimes I'd still animate stuff manually when the push transition didn't have what I needed, such as in this beautiful moment.
And the litigation dragged on for over a decade, but Zenith ultimately lost anyways.
I've also seen push transitions used to bring in cropped video elements, like this dumb infomercial, or this moment from Captain Disillusion. I've used it to go back and forth between two different things, always keeping their relative locations consistent. The film impact push has optional, customizable overshoot and bounce animations, which I've used to great effect, and I once used the overshoot animation plus a ridiculous spring sound effect to do this.
One cable. So if you had a 5.1 surround setup for
Because I was feeling silly. The Buncho layer style push transitions don't allow you to do this stuff, because they cannot be used on single clips, and always affect everything underneath themselves. I tried nesting to get around that, but it does not work. So maybe you can start to see why I don't like these Buncho layer style transitions, but they do have their place and I will talk about them later. Now, let's talk about time. Most languages are written from left to right, then top to bottom. This is probably because most people are right-handed, and you generally don't want your hand to immediately obscure the thing you're writing. There are some exceptions to this, like traditional East Asian script and the Kuk Tayor, who perceive time as flowing from east to west. But I'm making videos for people who can speak and read English, which goes from left to right. And it's not just reading. This cultural association of right means forward in time goes really deep. Western musical notation is read left to right. Time on a graph is always shown from left to right. Premiere's timeline moves left to right. The entire film of Snowpiercer uses right to mean forward. When you arrange products in order of age, it should be oldest on the left, newest on the right. When you take a photo of transistor sizes through history, you will tend to arrange them from left to right. Knowing all this, if I want to very explicitly show that time has passed, I will use a push to the left, because a left push simulates the viewer traveling to the right, which is forward in time. So the direction of the push is opposite to the direction of travel through time. Get it? This also means that a push right will simulate the viewer moving to the left, which is backwards in time. So here I used a push left to jump forward a few days to when this foot pump had unfrozen. A straight cut does not really work because those are used within the same scene, and an exposure flash does work, but I just think a left push works better. In this old video, I only had footage of Linus talking about using this bug salt gun outside, and then some footage of police officers who stopped him, but I had no footage of the actual police encounter. I'm still proud of my solution, which was to use a simple push left, accompanied with a siren sound effect.
So let's see if we can find some bugs to hunt, shall we? So our fly hunting expedition got cut a little short.
It's worth noting at this point that I learned to use the push transition in this way from watching Malcolm in the Middle back in the 90s. They often used a very short whip pan with a whoosh sound effect to separate different scenes. It's not technically a push transition, which would look like this. Here they are side by side. I think the whip pan looks better, but these two things are functionally identical. So that's where I learned this technique, now you know. Here I used a push left to go forward to the next day, and showed the slate at the start of the day's filming to make it obvious. I had to do this because, to my memory, Linus never explicitly said, "We're gonna stop filming for today," so I had to use a transition to make it clear. I did that again for day 3. So you might think that I only used the push transition to separate those 3 days from each other, but I also used it to skip time within the same day. Again, since a push left means going forward in time, a push right means going back in time. Here, the Mythbusters use a push right to show older episodes that also feature duct tape, and here I use a push right transition to go back in time within the same episode, and then a push left transition to return to the present moment. You don't really need the white vignette and sepia tone, but I did it for fun, I guess. Now, here's one case where a push left or right would both have been appropriate. The Mythbusters are on the docks, and the next scene is back in the studio. The editor decided to do a push right, because presumably the studio is back in that direction, to the left. So we're moving through space. If the editor had used a push left, then it could also be interpreted as movement forward through time instead of movement through space. So that would also work. The only two directions that would not work nearly as well would be a push up or down. But those would be appropriate if we were moving up or down inside of a building or something. Now, you might think that because English is read from top to bottom, that downwards is also strongly associated with movement forward through time, but it's really not. I've seen plenty of graphics that show time going from top to bottom, and plenty more that show time going from bottom to top, though it is a lot less common. The only one you won't see is time going from right to left. So now you know. The slide. A full-frame variant of the push is called the slide, where clip A or clip B remain stationary, like so. You can do this with the film impact push with this little menu, or you can just add a normal push transition on the head or tail of a single clip, which is the way I always do it. I don't usually use the slide because it explicitly reveals the frame edges, which looks cheesy, even if you try to disguise it with motion blur. Here's an absolutely terrible example of how to use the slide transition. It's slow, with linear motion, no motion blur, and the two shots have nothing to do with each other anyway. However, when those frame edges actually simulate real-ish things, like a sheet of paper or the edges of a web page, then I will use the slide transition. Here, I used it to slide away a piece of paper, revealing the host, Devin, underneath. This worked way better than using a push transition, because there's no good reason for Devin to be moving around, and I didn't want to imply a scene change. Aside from stuff like that, I don't really use the slide all that much. How fast should it be? The push is one of the fastest transitions. It just doesn't look very good when it's done slowly. My theory as to why has to do with where the viewer is looking. If you do a slow push, the viewer's eye will track along with that motion. But then as their eye gets closer and closer to the edge of the frame, they'll look back towards the middle, only to be pushed back over to the edge again. This is kind of annoying, and you usually don't want to annoy your viewer. Usually. But if you do, make sure you're doing it for a good reason. Anyway, with a fast push, the viewer's brain doesn't really have time to tell the eyes to start tracking the motion, and it gets extra blurry anyway, so there's even less reason to track the motion, and this all means that your viewer's eyes will probably stay pretty much exactly where they already were, and that's what you want. So there's a threshold of motion where the viewer's eye will deliberately not follow along. I'm not exactly sure what that speed is, I just kind of have a feel for it. At 30 FPS, for full screen left and right pushes, I use 7 frames, with an ease in and out of 50. And for up or down pushes, I use 6 frames, with an ease in and out of 40, which I think just looks a bit better than 50. You can see that these presets are pretty old. There are 2 parameters missing, so I'm gonna make new ones. I think a blur of 20 is too low, so I'm gonna increase it to 40, and I'll add just a little bit of chromatic aberration. When I use a push transition on a smaller object, I'll usually make it last longer. So I think I'll also add some slower presets and macro keys that are just for small object pushes. Though, come to think of it, the Film Impact travel transition would be more appropriate for that, since it would let me use any angle later, and I can add a bit of overshoot, which I don't want to do for a full screen push because then it reveals the other frame on the other side, like this. It's ugly. Anyway, where to get the push? Good news, everyone! The Film Impact push is the absolute best push transition, the gold standard, and it's free. You can use it forever after your 30-day trial. The free version does have some limits, though. Also, I know there's a watermark in this footage, just ignore it. It's only because I didn't want to make a second free account and then wait 30 days for the trial to expire. Remember, your 4 free transitions will not have a watermark so long as you do have an account. The free push transition has parameters for direction, blur, chromatic aberration, and holy shit, I just noticed there's a stretch parameter. Don't go overboard with that one. Keep it subtle if you use it at all, which I don't. I've never needed or wanted that, but I'm happy that it exists. With the free version, you can't change the ease values. But these fixed parameters are still way better than a linear push. You've also got anticipation and overshoot parameters, but without access to the easing controls, I think these are not very useful. The motion is just too fast for my liking, and only the ease controls can slow it down. The paid version of the push does have those adjustable parameters for easing in and out, plus the bounce and overshoot curve types, which each come with their own sets of extra parameters for bounciness, frequency, amplitude, etc. You can always make your animation look exactly how you want by adjusting these. And don't forget that you can keyframe most of these parameters, though I've never needed to, but you could, for example, make the motion blur end early if you wanted. And don't forget you can make your transition into a preset by using this menu up here. Note also that if you have a bunch of layers on either side of a cut, it works totally fine to just copy one push transition, unselect all clips, place your playhead over the cut, and paste. This will put it on all clips that touch the playhead, but then you'll probably have to adjust some clips so that everything lines up properly, which can be annoying. Alternatively, if you don't want to install Film Impact for some reason, and I can't think of one because it is very stable, Premiere Pro has its own push transition. It's pretty disappointing. You can control the direction with these tiny arrows, add a stroke, and that's it. No easing or motion blur. You can also get this transition from Mr. Horse for free. Just install Premiere Composer and their starter pack, which includes a few transitions. Click on the pan transition to get this menu where you can choose the direction, then click and drag that onto your timeline above everything else, centered on the cut between two clips. Remember, this is not a true transition, so if you go frame by frame, it's really obvious that there's just a hard cut somewhere in the middle of all that motion. Personally, I think this transition doesn't get going quite fast enough before the cut. I might have given it one more frame of acceleration. This pan transition does have what I call a long tail, which is nice, and almost completely unique to Mr. Horse, you can change the timing of this transition just by dragging the outermost edges left or right. So you can easily make the tail or head longer or shorter. It just frickin' works. Note that this adjustment layer-based transition affects everything underneath itself, so it can only be used for the full frame, not on smaller objects or on just the head or tail of a single clip. Even though I prefer the Film Impact push, I can see this pan transition being useful in situations where I have a lot of layers on both sides of a cut and I don't want to slightly extend all of them to make the true transition work properly. Unfortunately, I do see a 1 pixel gap at the very top that is not blurred, so that's annoying. I think it's an issue with Premiere's directional blur. But hey, Mr. Horse devs, this problem is fixable if you add a Gaussian blur with a very narrow mask to the top of the frame. But I found an even better solution. Just throw out the directional blur and use the Gaussian blur instead, because you can change the blur dimensions to just horizontal or just vertical. You're welcome. The fact that this transition just uses a cut somewhere in the middle does give it a different character and feel from a normal push transition, and sometimes, I assume, that's what you want. If you don't, you can try putting a basic cross dissolve underneath it, and quite often, it'll look good. Also, these Mr. Horse pans do work at a 45-degree angle, so that's cool. There are lots of other bunch-o-layer style push transitions, but I have not found a single one that is better than Mr. Horse. Here's just one example. I don't even know where this one is from, but you can see that I had to make cuts and make a nested sequence, which is horrible if I ever wanted to change the timing of anything. Also, 20 frames is too long, but that was my only choice for duration. You would apply this by dragging it out of the Effects and Presets panel and onto the nested sequence, but again, I don't know which one it is. I don't seem to have it anymore for some reason. Anyways, let's render previews and watch it. The cut in the middle is not too jarring, but there's something seriously wrong with the motion blur. Turns out this transition uses the transform effect for motion blur, which is a huge mistake, because its sample size is far too low. So you can see all these ugly repetitions all over the place. And the blur is linear, not smooth. Compare this to Film Impact and Mr. Horse, and you can plainly see that it's inferior. Worst of all, and this is very common with Buncho layer transitions, the resolution of your footage is reduced significantly during the transition. This is 1/3 of what it should be. That's fine when there's a lot of motion blur on top of everything, but absolutely not fine for the frames leading in and out of the motion blur. Mr. Horse, by the way, does not have this problem because they've used a very clever workaround that I will talk about in their dedicated chapter near the end. Maxon Universe has a push transition that they call the Swish Pan, and it's alright, but it's not worth using because Film Impact's push is better, and it's also free. Oh, Premiere also has a whip transition, which initially looks good until you realize there are no parameters at all, even to change the direction. Also, it has the dark edges problem, so not worth it. You just watched one chapter from a longer transitions tutorial, which you can also watch right now for free from the link below, or just click this little thingy on screen right now. The tutorial covers nearly every useful transition and every transitions vendor. I'll see you there.